Fellow baby boomers, where were you 50 years ago tonight? September 30th, 1960, ABC premiered TV's first animated primetime series, The Flintstones.
Picture this: a prehistoric suburb where dinosaurs double as household appliances, cars run on bare feet, and a big lovable loudmouth with an even bigger heart comes home every evening yelling his wife's name at the top of his lungs. For millions of viewers who grew up watching The Flintstones, Bedrock felt like the most familiar place in the world: warm, funny, and wonderfully simple. But here's the truth that most fans never suspected. Behind that bouncy theme song and those bright Stone Age streets, the production of this legendary show was tangled up in tobacco money, legal threats, labor injustice, dark storytelling experiments, and secrets that the studio worked very hard to keep buried. The Flintstones was not just a cartoon. It was a business, a battleground, and sometimes a mess, and the story of how it got made is far stranger than anything that ever aired on Friday nights. So settle in, because we are about to take a trip back to Bedrock that will change the way you see it forever. When Hanna-Barbera was building the Flintstones in the late 1950s, the animation industry was not the corporate, well-documented world it is today. Money moved through unusual channels. Unions held enormous power over distribution, and not every name on a production payroll actually showed up to work. People who spent time inside the studio during those early years later describe an atmosphere where certain financial arrangements were simply not discussed openly. Rumors circulated that some of the outside funding connected to early production came through individuals with ties to organized labor groups that, in that era, overlapped uncomfortably with organized crime. Workers who noticed names on payroll sheets that did not match any face they had ever seen in the building understood quickly that asking questions was not encouraged. Meanwhile, the union that controlled much of the physical distribution of filmed content across American television stations wielded influence that went well beyond shipping schedules. They had a hand in contracts and could apply pressure on broadcasters in ways that made studios highly dependent on keeping those relationships smooth. Nobody was ever charged with anything, and no formal investigation targeted the show specifically. But the culture of quiet compliance that surrounded certain financial decisions during those years left a lasting impression on the people who were there. Before a single episode of The Flintstones reached American living rooms, the show came dangerously close to being killed by a lawsuit. The problem was obvious to anyone paying attention. Fred Flintstone was a large, loud, impulsive working-class man with grand schemes that always fell apart. His best friend Barney was smaller, gentler, and perpetually along for the ride. Their dynamic, their arguments, their neighborhood tension, all of it looked and felt remarkably similar to Jackie Gleason's beloved live-action series The Honeymooners, which had aired in the mid-1950s and built an intensely loyal following. Gleason noticed. His advisors told him he had grounds to pursue the matter legally, and for a period of weeks, the people inside Hanna-Barbera genuinely did not know whether they would be allowed to continue. Artists had already spent months producing early episodes. Voice actors had recorded entire scenes. The machinery of a television series was already in motion. Eventually, the dispute was resolved without courtroom drama, reportedly in part because Gleason decided he did not want to be publicly known as the man who tried to strangle a cartoon in its crib. But the tension of those weeks was very real, and the show's survival during that early period was not guaranteed. When The Flintstones premiered on ABC in September 1960, it carried a sponsor whose product would be completely unthinkable in children's programming today. Winston Cigarettes not only funded a significant portion of the first season, but exercised creative influence over what appeared on screen. Fred and Barney were shown stepping away from their wives after dinner to share a smoke and praise the flavor and quality of the cigarettes by name. These were not awkward commercial breaks. They were scenes woven directly into the fabric of episodes, presented as natural extensions of the characters' daily routines. The genius of the placement, if you can call it that, was how seamlessly it was done. Fred would lean against the house, Barney beside him, and the moment felt as casual and domestic as anything else in the show. The original opening sequence even featured the two men sneaking away from their chores for a quiet cigarette together. Decades later, when the show entered syndication and reruns became standard programming for children's weekend television. Editors had to go through the footage frame by frame and remove or obscure these moments. It was painstaking work, but the alternative, leaving tobacco advertisements inside a show now marketed to children, was not an option anyone was willing to accept. For most of its development period, the show that the world would come to know as the Flintstones was internally called the Flagstones. That name appeared on early design sheets, concept artwork, voice recording session notes, and promotional materials that were prepared well in advance of the premiere date. The creative team had grown comfortable with it. Then, just weeks before the scheduled broadcast, someone flagged the fact that a comic strip already in circulation was using a nearly identical name. The risk of audience confusion or legal objection was too significant to ignore, so the studio scrambled to change the title with almost no time to spare. Everything that had already been printed, recorded, or produced under the old name had to be revisited. Voice actors came back into the booth to re-record lines that contained the original title. Music cues were rewritten. Posters and promotional merchandise were scrapped. The name Flintstones was chosen because it retained the same feel, hard, prehistoric, stone-based, while being clearly distinct. Ironically, the rushed, last-minute substitution produced a name that turned out to be stronger, more memorable, and more closely tied to the family at the center of the story. Sometimes panic produces better results than planning. Mel Blanc, the voice actor behind Barney Rubble, was one of the most recognizable vocal talents in the history of American animation. His career had been built at Warner Brothers voicing Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck, and dozens of other characters. When he joined the Flintstones, he brought that same distinctive energy to Barney's cheerful, slightly bumbling personality. Then, in 1961, Blanc was involved in a severe automobile accident that left him hospitalized and unable to work for an extended period. The studio faced a serious problem. Episodes were in production. Deadlines were fixed. The show had to keep moving. Another voice actor was brought in to study Blanc's delivery and replicate it as closely as possible. And for a period of several weeks, the Barney that viewers heard on their television sets was not Mel Blanc at all. Most people never noticed. The replacement was skilled, the character's voice was already familiar, and the humor carried the scenes. Meanwhile, Blanc's recovery was slow but determined. Studio engineers eventually set up a portable recording system at his hospital bedside, so he could begin contributing lines while still largely immobile. He would record short bursts of dialogue from a flat position, the microphone positioned above him, and piece by piece he reclaimed his role. His full return was smooth enough that it drew no attention. The laughter that punctuated every joke and pratfall in the Flintstones did not belong to anyone who had ever watched the show. The studio used a pre-recorded laugh track compiled from audience recordings made during live stage performances and radio broadcasts in the early 1950s. By the time the Flintstones premiered in 1960, many of the people whose genuine laughter was captured on those tapes had already passed away. Yet their voices continued to respond to Fred's schemes and Barney's mishaps, episode after episode, for 6 full seasons. The device that sound editors used to manage these recordings allowed them to select short bursts for quick gags, longer rolling waves for bigger moments, and gentle chuckles for quieter humor. Because the library of available laughs was limited, the same recordings were layered into dozens of different episodes, which meant that a viewer watching the show over many seasons was essentially hearing the same group of long-dead strangers laugh at hundreds of different jokes. Some studio workers found the whole arrangement faintly unsettling. Though practically speaking, assembling a live audience for every episode of an animated series would have been neither logistically feasible nor affordable. The original version of the Flintstones was built for adults. It premiered in prime time, carried tobacco advertising, and centered its stories on the workplace frustrations, financial anxieties, and marital dynamics of 2 grown couples in a suburban neighborhood that just happened to be made of stone. The humor was observational, slightly edgy for the era, and aimed squarely at the generation that had grown up during World War II and was now settling into domestic life in the early 1960s. When a studio introduced Pebble's Flintstone in 1963, That version of the show effectively ended. The baby required a new kind of storytelling, softer, slower, more focused on home life in ways that shut out the bolder adult humor the writers had developed. Several members of the writing staff later described the addition as a creative constraint they had not signed up for. Stories that had explored Fred's work troubles, neighborhood rivalries, or grown-up misadventures now had to accommodate a baby, which meant tonal compromises in almost every episode. Ratings shifted. The audience that had tuned in for the adult version began to drift away, replaced by families with young children who wanted something gentler. The show survived, but many of the people who built it felt they had lost the version they cared about most. When the small green alien called the Great Gazoo floated into bedrock during the show's final season in 1965, he was not a creative choice. He was a business decision dressed up as a story idea. By that point, the costs of producing the Flintstones had climbed steadily, and ABC was looking for an exit from its contract. The most effective way to engineer that exit was to make the show demonstrably worse, which would reduce its audience value and give the network justification for not renewing. Gazoo, with his condescending manner, his alien powers, and his complete disconnection from the grounded Stone Age world that the show had been built around, served that purpose efficiently. The writers who were instructed to include him did their best, but they were working against a character concept that fundamentally did not fit. Long-term viewers felt the disruption immediately. Something was wrong with Bedrock, and a show they had followed for 5 years suddenly felt unfamiliar. Ratings fell, the contract was not renewed, and the original run of the Flintstones ended after 6 seasons. Gazoo appeared in fewer than a dozen episodes, but his presence marked the moment when the people in charge stopped trying to make the show good. In 1960, American television operated under an informal but widely respected set of standards governing how married couples could be depicted on screen. The most visible of these standards concerned sleeping arrangements. Whether on CBS, NBC, or ABC, married television couples slept in separate beds. Always. The reason was a mixture of broadcaster caution, advertiser conservatism, and a lingering influence of censorship bodies that had shaped entertainment content since the 1930s. Fred and Wilma Flintstone ignored this entirely. They shared a bed. They were shown together in it, sleeping, waking up, having morning conversations, treating their shared bedroom like a place where a real married couple actually lived. Nobody stopped it. The most widely accepted explanation is that the prehistoric setting